Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your diligence, your consistency in participating. I think the work just got more interesting with all the conversations around the comprehensive plan. And I think that we are in a very, very good place where we get to hear all of this feedback, obviously, and know how we respond to them. And so this work in my mind has taken on another higher level of significance, frankly speaking. So please continue to pay attention to how things are going. And if there are questions that are not being clearly answered, please let us know. I think it's a work in progress. I know we're going to get there. We've got a great team. I will always have to say that we've got a great team, and we know that we will be able to make that connection between the comprehensive plan and this UDO, and that's really what's very important for us. So your work is actually very important because you are the ones who make this to come alive. So once again, thank you very much for your participation, and I will hang in with us. Alison and I will have to drop off around 12 to attend another important meeting on the comprehensive plan. Then Alison will come back towards the end. So, but thank you. If you don't see us, that's why, but she will return. So thanks. I'll turn it back to you, Laura.
Thank you. Alan, I think you got the next piece of this. And also in a minute, we have someone with a phone number that's joined. If they don't rename themselves, we'll probably want to find out who that is.
Yep. Thank you, Laura. And Laura and I are going to do the bulk of the presentation this morning, but we also, as usual, have Arista Strangis and Chris Jeanette from Camiros on the meeting with us. And Arista and Chris will be trying to keep up with your questions and comments in chat as Laura and I are going through the slides. And then, as we always do at the end, we will stop and go back and try to address any questions or comments that we may have missed during the course of the meeting. So today is a different topic for us. In the past several meetings, going all the way back to last summer, we have been mostly talking about proposed zoning districts. We're still in the zoning chapter of the UDO today, but we're going to move away from zoning districts and talk about off-street vehicle and bicycle parking and also loading space standards. But before we get into the meat of the presentation, are a couple of boilerplate slides that we go through every meeting. We are recording this meeting, and the recording of the meeting will be available on the UDO, charlotteudo.org website next week. Have a little patience. We're all stretched a bit thin these days, and it does take some effort and time to put the video recordings together and get the survey prepared and the materials out to you. But we will try to do that as quickly as we can, but certainly not until sometime next week. And as usual, if you want to speak, we'll get to a point in the presentation where we can take your questions verbally, but as we go along, probably the best way for you to comment or ask a question is by putting something in the chat box where we will see it, particularly Chris and Arista. They'll try to keep up with it as we go along, and then we'll get to the end and we'll get to a pause where we can go back and pick up any questions, as I said before. So here are the topics for today: vehicle parking standards, electric vehicle charging stations. That's something new for us. Surface parking standards, structured parking design, bicycle parking, and loading space standards. There are some policies in the draft comprehensive plan that discuss parking in one way or another. I won't read all of these, but I put this slide together just to reinforce the notion that we are implementing policies from the comprehensive plan when and if, not if, that was a Freudian slip, when it's adopted. And it does have some policies relating to parking and also a policy on electric vehicle charging stations. So for our parking requirements, we are taking a little different approach in the UDO to the one that is in our current zoning ordinance. We're going to be basing our parking requirements on zoning districts, and that's not unusual, but we're using a 3-tier approach, so as well as the zoning district. So we're sorting each proposed zoning district into one of these 3 tiers for the purpose of setting up our parking standards. And we'll go over those and how that's going to work as we go a little bit further. But since we're basing the parking on the zoning districts, I thought it would be useful to just do a really quick review of our zoning districts. This is what we've been talking about for the past many meetings, but just as a refresher, here are our proposed residential zoning districts. We've got the zoning districts for our neighborhood 1. They're all the N1, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, not G. We've got a manufactured home park district that we talked about in our last meeting, and we've got 3 zoning districts for neighborhood 2. So those are our residential districts. And then you've all seen this slide before, our version of it. These are our mixed use and non-residential districts, and they correspond to the various mixed use and non-residential place types. So we've been over these before. And then finally, our TOD districts, we have 4 of them. They will generally be found in one of our centers, either neighborhood center, community center, or regional activity center. And it's at this point that I'm going to kick it over to Laura to get into more detail about the 3-tiered approach.
Thank you, Alan. So as Alan mentioned, we have a 3-tiered approach, and you can see the 3 tiers here, and then give you a little bit more information on what happens in each of the tiers. But at a high level, we have the first tier, which are really are more auto-oriented uses, typically, not always, but where we would have the greatest parking standards, minimum parking standards, and we will not have maximum parking in these areas. Sorry, I have a visitor here. Okay. We have a middle tier where we will have our more kind of not as auto-oriented. And this is where a lot of our centers are, where we'll have both minimums and maximums is what we're proposing. And then the third tier is our TOD area and our urban center, which is our uptown core, where we would have no parking minimums except for a limited number of uses in certain locations, and really relying much more on parking maximums. So as you can imagine, when we get to the parking table that we will be getting to you guys, it's very, very, very detailed. So I wanted to give you the highlights and the approach that we've used so that you would have an idea when you see it, what the basis of thinking was. So again, tier 1, we have minimum off-street parking requirements, no maximum parking, and this is our manufacturing and logistics, our lesser intensity campus districts, IC1 and OFC, our community activity center. One of those districts are commercial districts, which are the commercial general and commercial regional mobile home park, manufactured housing park, all of our neighborhood 1 districts, and our 2 less intense neighborhood 2 districts. So anyway, that's kind of a lot of districts. So you see, we have a lot of districts in there. Typical standards for single family, for residential, it would be 2 spaces per unit. For other residential uses, 1.5 spaces per unit as minimum. For non-residential, the typical standard is 1 space per 500 square feet. And so we do have some other uses that have different parking standards based on their unique characteristics. Car wash and correctional facilities are examples where the standards that we would typically use for non-residential really just don't make sense. Tier 2 is that middle tier. It's our innovation mixed use, the more urban campus, our neighborhood center, uptown edge, the more intense community activity center, regional activity center, and into C, which is the most intense multifamily district. So in a minute, I might answer a couple of these questions too. So these include both minimum and maximum off-street parking requirements. Maximum does not apply to parking structures, and typical ranges for the parking requirements for residential, a minimum of 1 space per unit and a maximum of 2 spaces per unit. And then for non-residential, the typical minimum is 1 space per 750 square feet, and the maximum is 1 space per 250. So again, we have some different parking standards based on the unique characteristics of the use. And tier 3 is where we have put the districts that would have, in most cases, no minimum, and would be focused much more on maximum off-street parking requirements. These are our TOD districts and our urban center district. This is based on the current TOD approach. And so with TOD and with this, you have minimums only for 5 uses: live performance venues, micro production of alcohol, nightclubs, restaurants and bars. That may have been 4. And that's only when they're within 200 feet of the neighborhood 1 zoning districts. And the 1 space per 500 square feet is also required, it is the standard when we have a minimum plus 50% of the outdoor seating or activity area. And then maximums are typically 1 space per bedroom. And for non-residential, the maximum range is currently based on 1 space per 200 to 1 space per 300 square feet. Other vehicle parking standards, calculation, how we calculate vehicle parking spaces, they're based obviously on the use. And if it's mixed use, then you add up the requirements for each of the individual uses. They're required when you have new construction, you're required to comply when you have new construction of a principal building. An existing building is expanded, resulting in a requirement of more than 5 additional spaces from what's on a site. And also for a change of use, resulting in a requirement of more than 5 additional spaces. We do have some parking that is exempt from the parking maximums. That's accessible parking spaces per ADA. We have obviously want to support that. We know that that's really important for the community. We also have some of the EV charging, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If they're installed, would not count against your maximum. Pickup and drop off areas, as long as they're signed for that. On-street parking abutting the site wouldn't count towards the maximum. And then visitor spaces under certain conditions for townhomes and multifamily. We're also proposing electric vehicle charging stations. that we have some requirements for these in our ordinance. This is something that we just kind of touched on with TOD. We'd like to start here with the UDO and have requirements for multifamily stacked dwellings, residential component of mixed use, hotels, and parking lots and parking structures when those are the principal use on a lot. They would not count towards these installed spaces, would not count towards maximums. And where parking minimums are required, you would get additional credit for these at 1.5 spaces for each space you provided. And I'm not going to go through the details, but you can see, and you will see when you get this, that there is a table in the ordinance or the draft ordinance that will talk about, depending on how many spaces you have, if you're one of these types, one of these uses, what percentage or the number of spaces you'd need to provide. So we're talking about EV parking, but if we go to the next slide, tells you a little bit more about what we're talking about. So we have three tiers of electric vehicle charging station. One is where you're EV capable, you've installed the electric panel capacity, and I'm not going to get into the details because that's for someone else to do that knows a little bit more about this. We may have to pull on Andrew Ossel, who has worked on this a lot. So that's really when you're putting in the electrical. Then we have EV ready, where you're going a little bit further, a little bit more cost. And then finally, when you have installed the EV charging station. And obviously we would prefer to see these installed over being capable already, but we do accommodate and know that this is an evolving area. So we're trying to provide some flexibility, at least in the UDO, as we're initially looking at it. Just for full disclosure, we've talked about coming back at a later point and having a larger community conversation about EV charging and maybe testing the standards that we have in what we would call a future, what would be a future phase of the UDO. We also have standards for location and access. Again, this is by zoning district. You obviously cannot read this, or if you can, you've got really great eyes, but you will see this in the preliminary draft that we send to you of what types of standards would apply to different districts. A lot of this is related to location of parking, and particularly when you can park between a building and the street, when your parking needs to be to the side or the rear, and also where you get your access from. The last standard, which we're proposing for all of these, the non-residential districts, is like we do in TOD, moving the access away from our neighborhood one districts, areas, when there's the opportunity to do that. We also, like in TOD, deal with design of parking structures. So there are some standards that all parking structures would meet. Screening of vehicles, we have that in our current ordinance. Vehicle clear sight zone, which basically means is really for safety from a transportation perspective, and visibility. Treatment of decks to, at some level, resemble architecture of an occupied building, along streets and other frontages. So it's along the street, not the other parts of your building, and architectural elements to create pedestrian scale interest. We also, depending on your frontage type, whether you're a main street, an arterial, a primary frontage, secondary frontage, parkway, and so forth, and based on your zoning district, we have requirements like we do in TOD for different types of treatments of parking decks. So option A is the most design intensive, where all floors are wrapped and there's ground floor activation. Option B is there's ground floor activation and a step back for other floors of the deck. Option C is simply ground floor activation. And option D is having a setback with the landscape area. So you'll see those kind of standards from TOD expanded to other districts. And in some cases, you know, depending on the district, some of this may not even apply, but it really depends on the context in which these districts would be located.
Thanks, Laura.
I don't know, Alan, if you want to stop now and have Arista and Chris help with answers, or do we want to keep going and come back?
Well, I think we've got time to stop. We only have a few slides left in the presentation, and probably the slides that we've covered so far are going to generate more questions and comments than the ones that we have yet to come. So this might be a good time to go back and pause and try to address some of these questions and comments. Although it looks like Chris and Arista have been doing a pretty good job of keeping up. But maybe this may be a time to open some microphones and have a discussion.
So I would actually maybe ask if Arista and Chris could just kind of go through the chat, and then if folks want to discuss an item, put in chat that you'd actually like to have a verbal discussion of it. I think that might be the easiest way to do it.
Hi, and I can just quickly kind of summarize what we've been seeing here in chat. I feel like a news reporter on site. So it seems to be, it's less questions that we're getting and just having a very good discussion about kind of the approach that we're taking. So really on many of these, we just clarified a couple of points. It's been debates here whether there should be minimums in tier 2. Comments regarding applying the maximums to parking structures. You know, they do apply in tier 3, but in tier 2, there is no max on parking structures. Just wanted to clarify, somebody, I can't catch the comment just yet, but someone had asked about, you know, as commercial spills over into residential neighborhoods, and that's something that we see everywhere. If, you know, residential parking permits could help. That's an option to deal with parking stressors. However, that's not part of the UDO. That's got to be set up separately through either a city ordinance or a city parking department that would deal with that. So it's kind of a way to deal with the stresses of spillover parking. There were some comments here regarding EV charging stations, and that perhaps that they are too expensive, even the ones that are EV capable. And then I think the last one I wanted to note was the comment of the design of parking structures. Here, the slide that you've got up on the screen, that, you know, they make sense in TOD, but these kind of heavy design standards within other districts may be too onerous. I just want to say, as you kind of look at the table, what we've tried to do in areas that aren't as intense as TOD, you know, you see these are divided by frontages, and then you also see that you have a variety of options. I think, as Kevin in our group said, kind of the UDO team said, it looks like an alphabet soup, and it's true. You're able to choose one of these 3 different design options, and in many cases you see you have the option of just choosing D, which is just setting back and installing some landscape kind of along that frontage. I think this is kind of, Chris, chime in if I missed anything, but I think it's really been just a good debate going on here. And I don't know, Chris, if you have any other comments.
Yeah, you did a good job. Back to you, Laura and Alan.
I would just ask, is there, and maybe we do this at the end, come back and see if people put in chats of, if there's a topic that they'd like to actually have a verbal discussion on.
Yes, okay.
Alan?
Sorry, Laura, I was reading comments. Is that my cue to go ahead with the
That is
slides?
your cue, yes.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about bicycle parking a little bit. Similar to, by the way, do you like my photo on this slide? This is one of my favorite photos. Most of the photos on these slides are from my own library of photos I've taken in Charlotte and other places over the years. And do y'all remember before scooters when we had bike share bikes everywhere and how fed up everybody was getting with where they were being left? And this was an actual, I think this was at the East-West, I think this is on East Boulevard, but I don't remember. But I love this picture of all of the bike share bikes. Anyhow, bike parking.
Remember the controversy.
Yeah. And then these bike shares, except for the B-cycle, all seemed to just go away when we got the scooters because nobody wanted to pedal anymore. Everybody just wanted to jump on a scooter and ride around. I kind of like the bikes better. So like vehicle parking, there are some triggers for when bicycle parking is required, and that is essentially when there's new construction of a principal building or expansion of an existing building resulting that would result in 5 additional bike spaces based on the square footage of the building, or a change of use that would result in additional spaces being required. There are 2 types of bicycle parking spaces in our ordinance, both short-term and long-term. And we have all of this today, but the difference in our new proposed standards for short-term and long-term are that we're going to be basing the number of long-term as a percentage of the total. So we'll give a total and then we'll give a percentage that have to be long-term because it varies from according to the type of use where it makes sense to have more long-term versus more short-term. And then we've set some minimums and maximums because this has the potential to get a little out of control. Wherever bike parking is required, we're going to require a minimum of 2 short-term spaces. So that will always be the bar. And then if a use requires more than 30 short-term spaces, and they're generally based on the size, the square footage of the use. If you got a giant use, we're not going to make anybody put in more than 30 bike racks. Otherwise, it just gets a little crazy. The same for non-residential uses that might require more than 50 long-term spaces, which are spaces under cover. For huge projects, you could conceivably exceed that, but we're not going to ask anybody to put in any more than that amount. So there are 2 different types of bike parking, as I mentioned, short-term and long-term. Short-term bike parking tends to be the bike rack that we're all familiar with. The city has standards for bike racks in its land development standards manual. There are a couple of different approved short-term bike racks. But if a designer wants to go outside the box a little bit and design their own bike parking racks, they can do that and submit it to us. And if it meets the intent of our ordinance and if it's secure, we may approve it as an approved alternate. So those are the short-term bike parking options. Long-term bike parking can either be in a bike locker, like you see in the photo. We've got some of these at our transit stations, and you'll find them in other places as well. Or long-term bike parking can be indoors. It can be under a roof, as long as it's in an accessible area. And the thought being short-term bike parking are for visitors to the site who are only going to be there for a relatively short period of time, and then they're going to get back on their bike and leave. Long-term bike parking may be for employees who ride to work and their bike is going to be there all day long and it needs to be stored out of the weather in case it rains during the day, or for a residential facility that requires bike parking, perhaps where you know you're going to be parking your bike for a long period of time. So those are the two different forms of bike parking that we have. And then my final bullet point is that bicycle parking may be located in the public right-of-way subject to the approval of CDOT and, where applicable, NCDOT. Thomas, was it you who worked on a text amendment to let us do that in the right-of-way? Somebody,
It was, and that's why I'm being so protective of it right now. And
Okay.
I see the bullet point now, so sorry to kind of blow up the text, but yeah, I do think that, you know, as we kind of move that forward, like NCDOT will be a harder one. We know that one. But if there is some way to kind of streamline that process, that we don't need all the exhibits and all that kind of stuff that an encroachment agreement is, maybe there's like a simple short form that we submit to CDOT for that, just to make that process go easier.
Okay, I'm not familiar with the process that they're asking you to go through. So, yeah, we can cover that at a different time. Okay, and then finally, bicycle parking requirements will be shown in a table. This is just a sample. You'll get the full table when we send you the full text of the parking section of the ordinance. But not all uses will have a bicycle parking requirement. Some residential uses like single family duplex, tris, quads, and townhomes won't have a minimum bike parking requirement. The thought being that, you know, if you live there and you have a bicycle, you're going to figure out where to keep it, either in your garage or in your apartment or in your unit. And then other uses, commercial uses, such as auto-oriented uses like car washes and gas stations, where you're not likely to arrive by bicycle, or although you could be an employee and ride by bicycle, I suppose, or industrial uses like a junkyard or recycling center, where again, you're typically not going to be arriving by bike, will not have a minimum bike parking requirement. And then finally, loading standards. And these are all similar to what we've got in our ordinance. There will be a table that will list the number of loading spaces a development is required to provide based on the use and the size of the use. And there are some locational and design standards for loading spaces, that they won't interfere with the normal movement of vehicles. They'll be located entirely on the lot that it serves. Maybe in a surface parking lot if use only requires one loading space. We will never require more than 5 loading spaces for any single building, regardless of how large a building it might be. And then existing buildings that may not have loading areas or may have fewer than might be required would be exempt from these loading standards. We wouldn't make any building go back and try to retrofit a loading space onto an existing building. So that concludes our slides, and be happy to go back and Thomas is chomping at the bit to say something. So
I know exactly what he's going to say too.
So I want, that language seemed a little cagey. So I want to see what it is that you're actually saying here. Loading spaces shall not interfere with normal movement of vehicles in the right of way. Does that mean that it is allowed or is not allowed in the right of way?
Arista, do you want to, or Chris, do you want to jump on that one?
Hey, and can I jump in on one thing real quickly, just because I know we've had this conversation. Thomas, just to let you know, this is not service, it's loading. So we're still looking at the service component. I just wanted to let you know that.
How is service different than loading?
Loading is where you bring a truck, you get things on and off. Services where you've got a trash vehicle, frankly.
Loading is
Okay.
moving in or delivering
Loading out,
goods, delivering
dropping off
goods.
your
To
good, yeah.
Service is picking up trash and recycling.
Okay.
Yeah, can we talk about that a little bit more, especially in the more intense urban areas? I know there have been circumstances in the past where, particularly on a small lot, where one's use triggered the requirement for a loading space. And distinguishing between loading and services, when I'll be interested to see how y'all draw the line there. And we've also had a standard that says you can't maneuver, in the right of way. And to back a small truck into a dock I mean, a truck into a dock on a small lot almost necessitates maneuvering in the right of way. So have you thought about the relationship of not just the fact that the loading space is there, but how you access the loading space? And are we going to specifically address somebody's ability to be able to maneuver in the right of way if there's not room to maneuver on the site? Same question sort of applies to uses which are all front loaded, like you see up in NODA, and the service and delivery is pretty much all from the front. So several questions in one question.
Yeah, I guess let me answer the last part of that first. You said small site, so that would imply smaller buildings. So if the commercial building, for example, is less than 50,000 square feet, you wouldn't have a requirement for an off-site loading or an on-site loading space, I should say. So that could be part of the answer to this. I think we see the issues in urban areas about how difficult it is to fit a loading area and maneuvering on a site in an urban area where you're limited by the size of the parcel or what's around you. You know, I don't think that we're to the point yet where some of us are comfortable with allowing loading vehicles to back out into a street, which is why the requirement that all maneuvering has got to take place on the site. I know that's that's a challenge. Anybody else?
I was going to say, I think it's fair to say that that's an ongoing conversation. So I'm thinking about the front loading that you're talking about, Walter, with existing buildings. We may, and I'm trying to remember if we have anything in there, we may need to talk about kind of how things work for existing versus new. I think for new, we're not looking at front loaded buildings. So if you get to the point where you actually even trigger a loading space. So, and with respect to when you can maneuver where, I'll just be perfectly frank, we're still having that conversation.
Right. Well, Walter stomped on my question, so let's go back to my KG text thing here. What is this meant to mean? About whether or not this means that, because I understand the distinction that it's service and loading are different things. We can get into that later, but loading is still an important thing to happen in the right of way. So do we think that that's something that's going to be allowed as the way this is written?
I think it's a good question, Thomas. I'm going to be honest. I think we need to get your comments. We'll send a survey that really helps. Put them in writing. That especially triggers us to go back and look through this. I think we've been so focused, frankly, staff has been so focused on looking at the service issue because of the height of the floors and the parking decks that we've been not quite as focused on loading. But I think very valid questions for us to go back and look at and talk about.
And just to add a couple things on the loading, and again, this is referring specifically to loading, and we talked about and carried over the exemption that's in TOD now for existing structures without loading spaces or don't have the minimum required. That's carried over, and it would be carried over regardless, because it would be, even if we didn't have that, it would be a non-conforming site element that could continue. I think the intent here, as we looked at it, as you can see, kind of as Alan pointed out earlier, tighter sites, you've got less than 50,000 gross floor area, you wouldn't require to be put on a loading space. And the intent here is that if it's new construction and it's coming in and it's got to build in a loading space, again, not service, but loading, that the intent would be to get that maneuvering onto the site.
Okay. Well, I will say, to your point about this being carried over from TOD needs to be changed, actually, because that just doesn't work. So carrying that forward from that ordinance to this ordinance is a bad idea.
Okay.
in Thomas's
I
opinion.
mean, letting, yeah, sorry, I'm very adamant about this one because it's really difficult to try to get a semi truck to maneuver in a parking deck. I don't know if any of you guys have ever tried to run the auto turn on that, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And maybe also depending somewhat, Thomas, on the use, because you're just going to have some buildings that have enough loading, you know, that it's inevitable you can't load from the street, or there's not an alternative.
I mean,
But
use-wise, I
I
mean,
think
that's
it's those,
apartments, it's commercial. I mean, there's a lot of uses that require semi-access. And the reality is if you don't address it and you try to make it happen in sites, then it's still just going to happen on the streets where it happens now. People just block a lane and drop a truck. So let's try to be a little bit forward thinking about how you can actually make it actually work, so we don't end up with that situation. Just like the service discussion. So
Yeah.
yep, I'll put my little ticker in there, and then I am happy to have an offline conversation about this so I don't bore everyone with my particular pet peeves.
Yeah, we're always interested in proposed solutions too, and not just the, you know, calling
Oh, I
out
got solution.
the problem. Okay. Do we want to go back and Arista or Chris, do you want to go back and kind of review some of the comments that have come in that we may not have discussed yet? We've got some comments on EV charging. Do we want to go back that far? Do we have
Ellen,
some-
I had
like to
scrolled
talk about
through the chat and had a few kind of topics maybe for discussion, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And the first one I had was EV charging.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know if you could go back to the policy on that, because I do want to point out that we're just not pulling this out of the air.
Yes, it's policy 7.6 on the screen. Coming from the comp plan policies.
Yeah, so we do think that that we're seeing this in a number of other communities. I think Arista and Chris might be even able to see what they've seen in other communities. And that we don't want to get, as a community, caught flat-footed. But there was some chat about EV charging, and I think I'd like to open it up, if everyone's okay, to just kind of what do different folks think about having some requirements related to that?
And Laura, before, and I may ask, I'm going to maybe put Michelle on, Michelle Manns on the spot a little bit if she's with us. And I see John Friday has got his hand up as well. But we were concerned as we were talking about requiring EV parking stations with what the industry was doing in Charlotte today on its own without any requirements. Were development projects putting EV charging stations in without being required to? And so Michelle Manns from the Greater Charlotte Apartment Association was good enough to do an informal poll of some of her members. And if my memory serves, a great deal of them, if not most of them, were including some EV charging facilities in their projects as they were being built, as new projects were being built. I don't know, Michelle, if you're here and if you want to add anything to that. Well,
I'm curious, Alan and Laura, with regard to EV parking, you're quoting the unadopted comp plan, and that's fine. But it says requirements or incentives. I haven't heard any conversation about what those incentives might be. I did think I saw that something where an EV space was equivalent to a space and a half of otherwise minimum required parking or something like that. So EV spaces can reduce your total minimum required parking. But since then, 2 of the 3 tiers were either moving completely away from parking minimums or moving some distance away from parking minimums. These become an ongoing obligation to the property owner in terms of maintenance and service and liability. And so I'm wondering, it's easy to write requirements. I'm curious about what incentives you might have considered.
I think you've mentioned the incentives, and they may not seem like big incentives. I think the other incentives are that the market will demand these in the future. We're already seeing, and I know, Walter, you're a car guy. I mean, we're seeing some car companies that aren't going to be making any internal combustion engines in their cars in the next 10 to 15 years. And so more and more vehicles are going to be electric vehicles. And so the market will be asking for these.
That's why I keep the old ones, Alan.
Yeah. Michelle,
Alan, I apologize.
No,
I was
thank you.
actually eating lunch, and then and then I was trying to pull up the email where I responded to you.
I'm sorry. I put you on the spot.
Okay. It's okay. So absolutely, yes, I did reach out to a number of our, excuse me, developers, and several of them did respond that they are including them in their development and in their apartment developments. It was noted by one of our larger development companies that the demand does vary by the submarket, you know, based on the renter demographic and things of that nature. But it is an amenity that renters are seeking and they are utilizing. So I got a lot of favorable feedback from a number of developers, larger developers in this market who are including those in their deals.
Thanks, Michelle.
If the market is driving that, why do you need a requirement at all?
I'm going to suggest, so we don't turn into a free-for-all, and I know John Friday's had his hand up for a while, and I don't know if it's on this topic, that maybe, and thank you, Michelle, very much for us catching you off guard, but if maybe
That's okay.
If folks want to talk, they can raise their hands, and we could go in that order.
Yep.
And so John's hand is raised.
Thank you, Laura. Actually, on the EV stations, I would suggest doing all incentives. So if you have one, you don't have to have 3 parking spaces or something like that, because I do think the market's going to take care of it eventually. But I understand why you're looking at it. My question really has to do with parking. So what I see tier 1, 2, and 3 doing is they're reflecting a transition from least dense development to the most dense and the most urban. So you talk in N1, it's a certain level. When you get up towards Todd and towards the other, it's quite different, which is, I think, the way it should be. So the difficulty comes when we do place type locational decisions, and that is we put place types so near to N1, N2 that the parking overwhelms it, because the place type is in effect a tier 3 place type that shouldn't be next to tier 1, as we've seen with the Todd and some of our recent discussions. And one of the comments mentioned is do residential parking permits. But we're also talking about making it really easy to put bicycles in the public right of way with a simple form. And to get a residential parking permit would probably take an act of Congress and the city council. So I think both of those should be made really easy in the ordinance if we're going to use that in the ordinance as our solution. I think the better solution is to figure out the right parking for the place types that go near the neighborhoods that would be overwhelmed by too much development that close. So as we get to the place type mapping, that's where this is going to be really critical. That's all.
Thank you. Anyone else want to raise their hand, and we'll, any feedback on this? I know there was a fair amount of chat on the concept of spillover parking and thoughts. Is that Eric raising his hand? Literally, you're muted, Eric.
I know, I'm literally doing it because by the time I found the raise the hand in the in Zoom, it would have. I wanted to answer your question. Yeah, I think, part of the spillover, and I know that this may not be able to be, maybe it could be called out in the comp plan, maybe it can't fit completely into the UDO, but having a comprehensive parking plan for the whole city might be helpful. That includes more public parking, availability, also permitting in neighborhoods. I know also that might be impossible, but I think, if that was called for in the comp plan and the public agreed, then city council might have to approve it, especially in those areas where, the place types bump up to each other, especially like Noda and a bunch of other places. So I think that might be a solution. I'm just concerned, though, going back to the parking and the tiers, that still having those minimums in tier 2, especially since the comp plan calls to eliminate or reduce parking, and there's neighborhood centers that are supposed to be walkable. And if you continue to have the parking that is being built today, that everybody claims, has to be included in projects, or otherwise people won't build, which is a bunch of, malarkey, as our president would say. So I think we have to move beyond this, and the standards have to change dramatically, or otherwise we're not going to be making any change when it comes to our transportation investments, because the convenience of parking is going to always impact the investment we make as a community in multimodal, period.
You other thoughts? I know first Thomas has his hand raised and don't want to miss him.
All right, so I would like to go back to the EV station slide for a second.
Which one? That one?
The one where you guys talked about the percentages of this one. Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk about the EV capable aspect of things. I kind of mentioned it in the chat, but that's kind of a bigger thing to kind of make sure that you guys understand. So making them actually provide panel space that's a big hit, right? Because you have to design the transformers and the panels and all that stuff to actually facilitate that. What would be better, and just so you know, the amount of panel and transformer can be almost as much as a building itself if you're doing very many of these things. So it can be very expensive to do that. If you really want to have the EV capable, I would just say have a room dedicated for it, that they provide the room that a panel could fit into, and you can permit and all that, but don't actually have to put the panels in. And then just have conduit to the rest of it. But actually making them put in any of that infrastructure is basically the same of making them have to do the EV charging themselves. So.
Yeah, and I don't think any of us claim to be the absolute expert on EV charging, and you probably have got more practical experience than we do.
Just yesterday, I went through a whole big old thing about this. Yep.
Yeah. So these are the definitions that we've been working with. EV capable is installation of electric panel capacity with a dedicated branch circuit and continuous raceway from the panel to the future EV parking space.
Right. Panel capacity kind of sounds like you actually have the actual panel and not the room capable of supplying locating the panel.
Yeah, I think we maybe need to do a little bit more research to make sure that our standards are reflective of what we really expect, because I think our expectations were that these three options would be a gradual from lower cost to higher cost. And if you're saying that our lower cost option is actually a high cost option,
yeah,
that certainly isn't our intent, I don't think. Andrew,
yeah. I see
jump?
what you're trying to do here. I think just a little bit of clarification on it so that you have room for it, but you're not actually forcing them to kind of build all that expensive stuff now. So
Yeah.
I get your point.
I'm going to see if Andrew also, who worked on this with us, had any comments.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point and something that we want to make sure that we're not incurring maybe equal cost from EV capable to EV SE installed. The intent here is to get as much of that infrastructure in place at new construction, at development, so that, you know, when the market does demand more EV spaces, development isn't going, you know, folks aren't going back into a site and, you know, putting in all of that infrastructure later, because we know that's so expensive. And so, you know, I've seen a couple comments about affordability and stuff about EVSE, and we totally, you know, we're very sympathetic to that. And I think that's why this is in here, because we know that if you know, this is installed on the back end after a site's been developed, it's an increased cost. And so we're trying to make it, you know, available in a way that's going to save costs later for the development, so that doesn't get passed on to the homeowner or the developer, you know, at a later phase. So that's just kind of our thinking on that.
And a lot of developers are kind of going down that road too right now, Andrew, just trying to figure out how much they're willing to spend now to future-proof themselves as much as possible. So it's a very appropriate conversation. I think just getting some of these details right is the important next step.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I've seen some comments in chat that if the market is already providing EV charging facilities, why are we including it in the UDO? And I think that's a fair question, but I think that we want to be forward thinking, and I don't think that it's being provided by the market across the board. And I think that we think that it probably should be at least a minimum requirement to at least get people thinking about it and planning for it, because I think everybody realizes that EV vehicles are an emerging sector and they're becoming more and more. And so kudos to the developments that are already providing it and answering the market demand. But for those that aren't, I think this is a reasonable requirement to get them thinking in the same vein as the ones that are.
Alan, you're not going to turn around and make this a requirement for proposed or installed on-street parking, right? We're not going to turn down that road, right?
No.
Okay, good.
No, that's a city, you know, that's a city or an NCDOT or a CDOT.
Okay.
But we do have some on street.
And I did use an appropriate pun on that one, by the way. So.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
I said turn down that road, but
down
anyway.
the road. I got it. Yeah. Okay.
All right, I'm done.
I know Walter had his little hand up a minute ago. Walter, did you have something?
But to one little teeny question on this current topic, do the detailed standards for the EV spaces at whatever level include some sort of requirement for a preferential location for where they would be within your parking area? And then totally changing subjects, I believe I heard you say a while ago when we were talking about parking in mixed use or shopping center type developments, and I may have misunderstood you, that the parking would be based on the requirement for the individual uses. And for what it's worth, we moved away from that years and years and years ago because tenants change. And if a bookstore goes out and a restaurant comes in, they have different parking requirements. You really need to have some certainty if you're doing a mixed use property or a multi-use building like a shopping center, that whatever the tenants are, you don't have to start adding and subtracting parking just when they turn over. And if I misunderstood you, that's great. But I thought I heard you say it'd be based on the individual uses within the center.
I'm gonna ask Arista and or Chris if they could pick up those two questions.
Yeah, so the way the draft is currently structured, not to say, you know, obviously it's a draft, is that it would be the sum of the uses that are on the site. And we understand the issue that comes up with multi-tenant centers because as they change, the numbers can fluctuate up or down. What we've been trying to do is not create very onerous minimum parking requirements where we have them and kind of make them the same across the board for very similar uses. So retail, personal service, office, those types of things are all sitting, I think Laura put it on that tier 1 slide, around 1 per 500 square feet GFA. So you're kind of getting at it in a similar way. Now, that's not to say we don't want to kind of take another look at it and go back and see if we can define the multi-tenant retail center and say, if you're developing it this way, then we'll just put you at 1 per 500 for just the center as a whole, regardless of the use. But it's a point that we should kind of just take back and think. I think we're equalizing based on not getting so into the weeds on what each individual use requires as a parking requirement and make them all very similar, if not identical. But we may miss something by even just doing it that way.
Yeah, I would strongly urge you to consider for a shopping center a single standard, because the financing of the center is going to, and the finance and requirements of the individual tenants are going to drive the real parking count. But the smaller the center is, the more difficult it is to react if you have a big change in a tenant in terms of that tenant's individual demands for parking. I think the current ordinance says that centers below 50,000 feet, you pretty much do it on an individual basis, but above that, it's one number for anything that goes there. And that way you can plan on your development and you can meet the expectations of your tenants.
I think, Walter, that's a good point. We'll have to go back and look and see if there's any differentiation in standards for anything that would truly go into a shopping center. Because as Arista said, it's probably across the board the same standard.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah, I think we should look at it, Laura. I agree. And I wanted to go back to capture Walter's first question on the EV capable or EV installed rather. Well, I guess it would apply to all of them. The preferred location within a parking facility or within a development. So far, I don't think we haven't discussed that. So perhaps we can get some guidance from people that have designed these as to where they're actually going or where people think they should go. Should they be the next closest spaces other than the ADA accessible spaces to the building entrance, or should they be tucked away in a far corner, or does it matter where on the site they go?
If you'd
That's
like,
why I asked the question.
if you like, Alan, I can kind of talk to that a little bit. First of all, I don't want the city to kind of get involved in where those go. Just as long as they're on site, it's kind of a development-based thing. So getting extra regulations to specify exactly where they go is just problematic. But I will say that you're exactly right. These spaces are designed to be accessible, though they are not designed to be exclusively accessible. So they need to be in a relatively flat space. We generally place them next to an existing accessible space that we can use their loading zone without losing space on site. You generally try to spread them out across your sites, but you don't want them at the front doors of your bigger buildings or your particularly your leasing centers, because they're a little unsightly. But you do try to locate them wherever your biggest population is, but they're not tucked in a back corner typically. So just quick guidelines on how we locate those.
Okay, thank you.
Now, Ellen Estrella has had her hand up for a while.
Thank you, Laura. And this goes back to John Friday's comment earlier in terms of kind of residential next to activity centers. And in this case, it's, as you know, historic district next to Todd and parking. And I just want to make the point that we bat this around all the time, and parking permits, in an area like this where there are no driveways, no garages, everybody's on street parking using the public street. Parking permits for older people who've been here for a long time, or people who are, not so easily able to afford that. Wilmore, along the edge here, is just something to consider. We find it to be a little bit can be discriminatory. So just to throw that out as a blanket solution, I think we have found that we have to consider that more carefully. I realize it's not part of the UDO, but I'm just raising that point in case somebody's not thought of that before.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Ellen, appreciate that. Does anybody talking to the UDO team, going back through the comments, see something that we need to go back to or missed or expand upon?
I was just going to say, as I'm looking through my notes, so one comment that we got was that the maximum number of parking spaces in that middle tier should apply to parking decks. Right now we have that not applying to parking decks, but that it should. Any feedback from the group on that? I thought it was an interesting comment. And I know who made it. He's got his hand raised. Eric, you want to talk a little bit about your thinking on that? And like to hear what others
I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, and clarify so others before they, throw their comments in that, just looking at what districts that applies to. I think including the neighborhood center and maybe even the N2C in that might, I think just evaluating that, not that, like looking at what actually would have a parking deck in it, all that kind of stuff. Maybe just making sure that all of the districts it makes sense for. Is kind of what I'm concerned about. Two of those in there.
It was our thinking that parking structures are pretty expensive per space, and that generally speaking, nobody really wants to spend more money than they have to on building additional parking spaces. So that's one reason why we didn't consider or we didn't end up with a parking maximum for parking structures in that district, is that we just didn't think we really needed it, because nobody was going to build giant parking structures if they didn't need the parking. And I think
I don't know about that. A lot of people continue to build those garages because they feel like they need to. I know they don't want to, but we just see parking decks going up all over the place, even in Uptown, and just crazy. We have so much parking. It outnumbers all of us, the people versus parking spaces.
I think interesting thoughts, and we were trying to find that middle ground, but I'd like to know, anyone else have thoughts on that topic? One raise their hand.
Yeah, Laura, I've got a couple of thoughts on that. In the last couple of decades, as a community, we've been sort of transitioning from our 50s and 60s suburban development pattern to more of an urban development pattern, some in more places, more in some places than in others. And one of the things that always comes up and has been a staff issue on many, many, many occasions, is if someone is at the edge, if you're in NODA, for example, because it's come up there, and you have commercial uses along the street, and then on the facing street behind those uses, you have single family residential. And the issue of parking is always comes up. And if we're doing a rezoning, we're very often asked to put more than the minimum parking in. And so in the context of the community, just now learning about the comp plan, and I doubt if anybody's had a real chance to digest it at the level that y'all have in terms of the individual policy statements, maximum parking gets to be kind of tricky, because it assumes that there's a point beyond which there either won't be a demand for parking above that maximum to serve that use, or the parking would be provided somewhere else, and most often that spills into neighborhood streets, which creates a conflict. Or as Eric points out, if you keep having so much parking, what's the incentive for anybody to do anything but drive their cars? And I'm not necessarily arguing that point, but just in the context of how we have come to develop over the years, that always gets to be a testy point. And so in the tier 2, when you've got a minimum and a maximum, or even in the tier 1 with the where the N1 districts are, I'd like y'all to talk about, or maybe give some more thought to, the tension between where parking ends up to serve a particular use. If all the spaces on North Davidson Street are occupied, people tend to migrate to where there's a space available, and the private lots are so tightly controlled that people park on the street, and the streets belong to everybody. So the point here about maximum parking, especially along the edges where we transition from one zoning district to another, is something that I would hope we might give some more thought to. I don't have an answer for it. I just have encountered it many, many, many times over the years.
And I think, if I've understood correctly, that is kind of what Ellen and John Friday were also talking about.
Yeah.
So I do think that's something we'll need to take a look at.
Jim Merrifield, you've got your hand up. Jim, if you want to unmute yourself.
There. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I wanted to put in a word on this, on the maximums, and I think it also applies to the electronic vehicles. And the question is, if you're social engineering using this UDO rewrite to do some social engineering, and the idea that, well, we have too many, in some theoretical sense, too many parking spaces. Well, the market is going to decide how many spaces you need. And if you're not providing them, then people are going to go somewhere else. You're not going to force them to go to NODA or downtown or wherever else it is. And they'll go to some other part of the community that they can, if they decide they want to drive and park, they'll do that. And really, in the bigger picture, if Charlotte isn't doing that well enough in creating urban spaces that people like, that they can do what they want, then they're going to go to Nashville and Austin and Jacksonville and other places. So I think there's a limit to what you can really do with this. And I think that same comment applies to the electronic vehicles from a cost standpoint. If you're layering in costs, and each of these things you do, it's cumulative, then at some point, then the market responds. And so I think that using the UDO as a way to put in new restrictions or new ways of trying to alter people's behavior is very risky and ill-advised.
I certainly hear that. And Alan, can you remind us kind of with the comprehensive plan, what the policy is? And I'll be honest, I have to go back and
Well, yes, and you can see the policies that we've selected out of the comp plan that we found discuss parking regulations or some aspect of that. Yeah, and Jim, I hear you about your comments about letting the market decide how much parking to provide, and if people aren't happy with what the market is doing, they'll go find a different market. I'm not sure I like the word restrictions, though. I mean, we do have parking requirements in our current zoning ordinance, and so we will have parking requirements in our new zoning ordinance. We're not going to eliminate parking standards in the ordinance, and the market will control, because I don't think anybody does that. Well, very few people do that. There are actually a couple of cities now that have eliminated all minimum parking requirements citywide. Hartford being one that I'm familiar with, and at least another one that I can think of. But in developing, or at least in discussing what the new parking standards should be for the UDO and in this 3-tier system, I think we all recognize that our current minimum parking requirements in our zoning ordinance are probably excessive in most cases. And so even in areas of the UDO where we will propose to have minimum requirements, they are considerably less than the minimum parking requirements of our current zoning ordinance. So we're trying to reduce the amount of parking that we require. We realize also that in some types of developments, like a suburban shopping center, we won't have a parking maximum. And if, you know, if the market demands a lot more spaces than our minimum, then the market is happy to provide that. But we do want to, in some cases, maximize the amount of parking that development provides to try to create more walkable communities and encourage other modes of transit and transit use. And I mean, I don't prefer to think of that as social engineering. I think that's good urban planning.
And I do want to say, I think we've tried to, and if we've missed the mark, I think we'd like to hear from folks. But have parking maximums that are realistic and work with what the market is, and we're really trying, frankly, to address the outliers who may really be building too much parking on a site. So we need you guys to look at those standards and see if we're realistic on that. And I think we've had a number of comments that in some cases our parking minimums are too high. So it's interesting, a lot of perspectives on that. So we tried to give a pretty wide range between minimum and maximum in that tier 2. Now, frankly, in tier 3, it's already in place with the exception of UMUD, our uptown district. And it seems a little odd to have parking maximums in TOD and not have them in our center core. And now, Eric, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment to Jim's point and the market. I'm all for getting rid of minimums altogether and letting the market decide what is needed. And even taking what your minimums are currently and making the max, like in 1 parking space per unit as a minimum requirement, maybe working that to be, if you're not happy with 1 unit as being the max, then maybe 1.5 or something like that, and make that what is a reasonable amount be the max. So you don't have the people building more than they need to, unless maybe there's shared parking spots or something like that, where you can work something out to go a bonus above the parking if it's open to the public. Something like that needs to be put in place. So you make no minimums, your maxes are what your old minimums used to be, and then you get some bonus or exception to it if you're going above and beyond and providing a benefit to the public.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah,
we've got a room full of people that we haven't heard from yet. So please feel free. I know some of you have made some comments in chat, but we've got a lively discussion on parking going on, but it seems to be limited to just a very few of us. So we'd love to hear from some others in the room. Brent, I see you've unmuted yourself. It looks like.
Yeah, I was just going to say, can we go back to the issue of permits? And I understood somebody's point that, you know, you guys aren't the permitting people. That would have to be a separate ordinance. But where can we coordinate this so that we think, so that when you're creating a space where some of the parking is going to have to be, you know, on the residential streets, then we come up with a solution to how much of the residential street space will be free for all for people to park and how much of it will be reserved for the residents.
I think that may be a question for CDOT.
I mean, you guys can make a plan, but then if it's not followed up with an ordinance for that district that says, okay, there will be X number of free spaces or metered spaces, and then X amount that will be restricted, you know, what you do does no good if we don't follow up with that. I just don't know how we set up a process to coordinate all this, but it does work. I mean, I've seen it work in other places, and it's a great system.
Arista and Chris, have you seen any place, or are you guys familiar with any place that is tied, and if, Brent, if I have this wrong, please correct me, that has tied the provision of parking to kind of metered and permit parking in neighborhoods? It's an interesting concept. And I don't know, Brent, if you know of any place that does that.
The system we had in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I lived, was that on a couple of the semi-arterials leading out of the downtown area, there was like 2-hour parking or 3-hour parking along the street. Then when you got into the really residential streets, we had permits. I mean, I had, you know, when my stepson lived with us for a while, we had to get a permit so that he could park on the street so that he wasn't blocking our driveway to get in and out of the house. And it worked fine. And occasionally we had people who would come park on our street, look around and go, oh, the hell with it, I'm walking to the restaurant. And we then had the right to call and have them ticketed or towed if it came to it. And it was a free thing. First, people were a little upset in the neighborhood. They said, I don't want to pay to put my stepson on the street, but you didn't have to pay since you live there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
and
just to say that's a fairly standard parking program. That's many cities have that on kind of your major streets. You would institute metered parking in certain areas, depending. And I don't know how this would translate out for Charlotte. And then your local streets, you would have, and the way that it typically works is that, you know, neighborhoods or grouping of blocks get together and come up with their desire for a parking permit, take that to the parking authority, get those streets designated. In some cases, you're designated all times. It's 24-hour. You can only park here with a permit. In other cases, it's only, you know, after like 6 p.m. that you have to have a permit to park there. There's a variety of ways that you can work that program depending on the stressors that are coming into that residential area. But that's kind of something that is kind of completely different from kind of where at. It's basically starting to manage how the streets work, and what the boundaries would be and all of that. I mean, it's a fairly common program across the country. So I don't know if there's anything else you'd like me to kind of add on that, but it wouldn't be something related to this effort because it's a completely different authority that something like that would be issued under.
Yeah, I'm just saying it would affect the amount of spaces. If we know that we can put a couple of hundred cars in a given area on the surrounding streets, then we don't have to have 200 spaces in, you know, dedicated parking lots or decks.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to get at in terms of tying parking requirements in the zoning to something like that, just because a parking permit situation is so much more fluid than, you know, land development regulations would be, you know, and subject to change. As Arista was saying, you know, you get a bunch of your neighbors and you go to the parking authority and suddenly a lot of that on-street parking is gone. So then what do we do? It's a very risky thing, and we haven't seen it, and I can't speak for Arista, but I haven't seen it anywhere where zoning requirements related to parking are tied to a permit.
Okay.
No, it's never, the two have never been tied together for the exact reason, Chris, that you said. It's a very fluid system. It also has to do with, you can have the permits, but if you don't have the enforcement, then it doesn't matter. So it's never been tied to parking requirements or establishing minimums and maximums, as it were, because of that situation. It could be that you had metered spots for years, but then all of a sudden, you know, for some reason that street, we've seen it, needs to be, they need to expand and take that lane, and then all of a sudden those are gone. So
good afternoon, everybody. This is Kevin, and I just wanted to, I'm sorry, Laura, if I just wanted to say a quick word, and this addresses both Brent's comments and Ellen's. Neither of your comments are falling on deaf ears or are lost, guys. We do actually have with us today some CDOT representatives. I'm not going to call them out, and I'm not going to ask that they make a comment unless they'd like to volunteer. But Brent, you expressly asked, so, how do we get maybe from where we are to there with looking at management of parking on street? And so I just wanted to let you know that there are ears in our audience to where both your and Ellen's comments have been heard.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, because I actually think I was going to call them out. But I also want to ask Alan, as you were looking at the comp plan, and we've got a couple of folks from the comp plan team, I think, on here, is there discussion, remind me, in the comp plan about parking permit systems at all? Does anyone remember?
Laura, I didn't come across any, and Kevin, I know you looked for parking comments for us as well. I'm assuming you didn't find any, because otherwise you probably would have brought them out.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, everything that I had found at a very high level with regard to policy initiatives in the comp plan, many of them were already referenced by our team in one of those earlier slides, and they really kind of spoke to the provision of levels of parking, not necessarily parking management programs per se.
Yeah.
I think while the conference, because this sounds like a topic that there's a lot of traction around from at least folks on this group, that while there's an opportunity to still submit comments related to the comprehensive plan, I would suggest doing that if folks think that that's an important tool that our community have.
We are nearing the end of our time, so I don't want to rush people, but we do want to make sure that if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please do it real soon, because if not, we're going to move on to our meeting conclusion. I was looking for Allison Craig, and I don't see her back yet. So we'll hang around for a couple more minutes and maybe do our last slide, Laura, and then see if
Sure.
we've got any wrap up. Okay.
So we are still working on the parking and loading standards, just kind of finalizing at least the initial draft or concepts we talked about today. We won't have necessarily made changes based on the feedback today yet. That would come after we gather the remainder of the comments through the feedback survey. I'll say again, if you want to guarantee that we are hearing you and that we respond to you, please put it in writing for us in the feedback survey. And then we'll be back again in 2 weeks from today to discuss landscape standards relating to parking lot screening, buffers, and so forth. So that's where we were. I see that Walter has his hand raised.
Yeah, just one thing real quick. The issue of the on-street, not on-street parking, but the loading requirements and or service requirements, as y'all separately define those as we go. We had a lot of conversations with CDOT about that many moons ago. Laura, you may remember when we were working on trying to create a zoning district for the Gold District. And we specifically called out the situation with the small lots and this, that, and the other based on what the current ordinance required. And there was a lot of pushback from CDOT on that at the time. And so it strikes me that it's going to be very important for many of these people whose names I see, but whose faces I don't, that are CDOT folks. I think that's a real, it's a way to help reduce the overall amount of new parking that gets built. The fundamental premise in Charlotte has always been that you can park on any public street in the city unless there's a sign that tells you can't. And the residential permitting, the residential permits in Charlotte, principally in the center city area, Fourth Ward, I think was the first one to get it, were because there wasn't enough parking to support the large amount of employees that back then were working in the center city, and so they were spilling out into the neighborhood. So those two things to me are very critical, and based on my work and involvement over the years, and also in terms of moving into a more urban form, a more intense form of development, which is going to be more than just center city and more than just centers, neighborhood nodes, or whatever we choose. And I would hope that there can be some maybe a separate group that talks about that includes both planning staff, CDOT staff, and maybe some folks like Thomas who do that sort of design work. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any other final comments, thoughts? If not, I think we're gonna wrap now. Look for the information that we send you in your inbox. We are, just to let you guys know, particularly from a zoning perspective, we're really trying to get pretty much a full zoning text. Working on that right now. It's a lot of information. So in the next couple of months, getting that to you so you can see all of it in context. I think we've been giving you pieces, and at times we've heard from people that it's really hard when you don't see all of it. So letting you know that is coming, and we really, again, appreciate all the time that folks have put into it and all the feedback. We do listen to it, take it to heart, and making adjustments as we go based on a lot of what we heard. So thank you, and we will see you guys in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you.